So, as always, were you successful with that? Let's solve this together. First of all, we need to create a Vue app, of course, where we pass in our config object, which we store in a constant or variable, and then we mount that to our assignment here, to this assignment section, selecting by that ID. And now the first task was to fetch the user input and use the input as a CSS class that's added to this paragraph. And the available classes are user1 and user2 because these are the classes I predefined in the styled CSS file. Of course, you could add more classes if you want to. To achieve that, I will first of all add my data option here to this configuration object. And in here, I want to store the user input. I'll name it input class, but the name is up to you. So here I want to store whatever the user enters into this input, and to easily get access to that, I'll use vModel. I don't really need two-way binding here, but it's just very easy to, well, get and store the user input with it, and therefore, well, I'll use it. As an alternative, you could of course use view_on or add input, and then manually extract what the user entered and store that in the input class data property. But vModel is simply a bit quicker here. So with that, I have the user input. And now to set this as a class here on this paragraph, I want to bind class dynamically. And we can start super simple. I don't need that object syntax here. Instead, I can simply bind it to input class. And now whatever the user enters will be added as a CSS class to this paragraph. It's as simple as that. So if I reload, I can type anything I want, and it will have no effect because no class of that name was defined in the CSS file. But if I enter user1, we see a different style. And if I enter user2, we also see a different style. But whatever I enter is added as a class. And you can confirm this by inspecting the paragraph, of course. You see now my strange input is added as a class. So every keystroke updates the class, but only user1 and user2 are actually classes that are also defined in the CSS file. Now, if you don't want to do this on every keystroke, if you don't want to add any input as a class, you can of course alternatively use the object syntax and add the user1 class if input class, so whatever the user entered and what's stored in this input property, if that's equal to user1, and do the same for a user2. This is a bit more code, but it makes sure that we only add user1 or user2 as classes and not any input. You can of course also put this into a computed property to get that long code out of the HTML code into JavaScript. But this is optional. I just want to show the different alternatives here so that you are aware of them. But with that, that's task 1 already solved. Now move on to task 2. There we have the toggle paragraph button, and we want to use the visible and hidden classes, which are defined here in the CSS file, to show or hide the above paragraph, so this paragraph. So we want to add hidden or visible. Clicking the button should toggle between those two options. So how could we implement that? Of course, we'll need a click listener because we want to do something when the button is clicked. And then we could add a new data property, paragraph is visible, for example, which initially is true, let's say. And we want to change this property upon every click. So we can add a method here, which we could name toggle paragraph visibility, but the name is totally up to you. And in here, I'll set this paragraph is visible to what it's currently not, by using that same trick I showed you before. I invert the value so that if that was true, it's now false. If it was false, it's now true. Now I point at this method here on my click listener. And with that, we are changing this value. Now we can use that value to add our hidden or visible classes to this paragraph. So I'm going to add even more classes, and that's now definitely the point of time where I will remove that from HTML and instead add a computed property to keep the HTML code short and readable. Now here in this computed property, I'll name it para classes. Name is up to you, of course. And I return this object here. Important, now input class needs to be accessed on this because we're now in the view instance. Let me reformat that to make it easier to read. And now I also want to add the visible class. If this paragraph is visible, is true, but this is a redundant check since true or false is the required value here for this visible value. For this visible property, we can just point at it. And we want to add the hidden class if not this paragraph is visible. So if this is false. And now we can assign para classes to this dynamically bound class. With that, if we reload, if I click toggle paragraph, it's gone. If I click it again, it's back again. So this now works. And now we got task number 2 solved. Task number 3 uses inline styling, which I mentioned you wouldn't use too often, but of course you should still be aware of how to use it. And essentially here, I want to make sure that the user is able to enter a background color, so either a hex code or one of the built-in colors like red and blue, and I want to set this as a background color to this paragraph. Now for that, again, we can add a new data property. Input background color could be a fitting name. And I want to set the style on the paragraph dynamically. Hence, I'll use vbind or the shorthand, just a colon, on the style attribute to pass in an object here and set background color, since it's a word with a dash, using this camel case notation where we omit the dash and instead capitalize the first character after the dash, and set this equal to input background color, so to this data property. And now we simply bind this with vmodel again to save some time to that input here, so input background color. Now with every keystroke, whatever the user enters as a color is saved here in input background color. And we're then setting this as a color for the CSS background color property as a style on this paragraph. So if we now reload, if I set this to red, we got a red background. We can also go for orange or blue, or also use some hex code. That all works, and that's the styling assignment done. I hope you got a lot out of that, and with that, you're now prepared to make your next steps deeper into Vue land.